All right, guys, this week we are going to start talking about urbanization, about why cities form, the good parts of having cities, and what could be the bad parts of having cities, and how this could relate to the quality of our environment. For the first time ever in the history of our planet, most people are living in what's considered cities, urban areas, rather than rural areas. The bulk of our population is found in these cities, and people flock to cities for many reasons. One, of course, is jobs. All right, cities are usually in places where there's going to be provided a lot of jobs and a wide variety of jobs for the people who live there. Otherwise, there would be no incentive to live there. Also, there are cultural things, things to do, recreational activities. There are lots of opportunities to meet new and different people, educational opportunities. And so cities have a lot to offer. Our rural areas do too. So they both have different qualities to them. And as a former city girl myself, I now much prefer living in a rural area. But there was a time in my life where I really wanted to live in that city, and I learned a lot living there. So let's start with some terms we need to know, and these are really easy terms because what they're called is actually what they are. So land cover is any vegetation or structures that cover the land. All right, so like this is a forested area versus farmland versus suburban housing development. Okay. And then we got land use, which is different. That's how we use the land in particular. What are we using them for? And so humans, as humans, we change the land cover based on what we want to use it for. And we have especially changed the land cover in urban areas. And we'll define what an urban area is in a minute if you're not sure. All right, and so of course, changing your land cover is going to change the environmental conditions in that area, and it can also have economic effects on the area as well, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So down below, I have some examples of land cover type versus land use, how we use it. So rangeland is a land cover type, and that's for grazing your livestock. So the use is for grazing, and then we call that land cover rangeland, okay? Our forested land is used for a variety of things, harvesting wood, wildlife, fresh nuts, recreation, and other things like that. So the land cover is forest, and then you have these various uses. And then, of course, cropland, very important, right? Got to grow some food for a growing population, is exactly what the use is for, but it's called cropland. And you can see the other ones below. So what exactly is urban and rural areas? So you might be surprised. Most people know the word urban and associate it with cities. So this is land mostly covered with buildings and roads. But what most people don't know is that it includes the suburbs, which is where many of us live. We live in the suburbs, these housing areas right outside of the city, especially us living in Roanoke County, because the city that we are living near is Roanoke and Salem, and they're two separate things, but mainly Roanoke City. And we live in the suburbs, most of us, surrounding that city. Now, some of us actually live in a rural area, and when we live in a rural area, then we're mostly surrounded by farms, or we have forested land, and things like that around us. So you don't have neighbors right next to you, okay? So where I live in Botetourt County, and where I live is kind of almost suburbia, but also rural because I'm across the street from a farm. But there's also on the other end of my road a housing development. I just happen to be on the opposite end. And so everybody in my neighborhood has like a couple acres of land. So this would be one of those gray areas between, do you call it suburb or do you call it rural? And probably in where I live, you're going to see it zoned for both, okay, depending on where you are. But most cases, what you guys in most cases are living in is suburbia, like where you have these housing districts and you can wave to your neighbors from your front yard. So urbanization, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot in this unit, is when people move from these rural areas into cities and our cities grow. Right now, more than 20 cities have at least 10 million residences in the United States. So that's where the bulk of our population is in these cities. And then on top of that, these cities spread. So if you look at Atlanta here, so here is Atlanta, which is a quite large city in Georgia, if you're not aware. This is in 1990. The bulk of the population of Atlanta was not just in Atlanta, but in all these different counties right outside of it, towns or counties, okay? And then if we look at 2000, just 10 years later, you can see how much the population has grown and taken over these places. Because if you move to Atlanta, usually for jobs, right, then you have to find somewhere to live. And as we're going to talk about, living in the city can get very expensive. And so people start suburbs. And those just kind of tend to sprawl out, which is one of the things we're going to be talking about as a problem in 10.2. So here's where we live, right? This is Virginia. And so if you look at Virginia, where the bulk of our population is, that's the dark blue. Over here in the Chesapeake Bay area, where you have like Suffolk, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, around the Richmond area, and of course Nova, Northern Virginia. And so here's us over here with Roanoke City. You can see Roanoke City has a higher population. Salem's right next to it, and Roanoke County is right around. And Roanoke County, as you see, we have different colors in there, right? We aren't super highly populated, but you can see that the darker blue is right outside of the city. And what that is our city is basically spilling out into our suburban areas. And then what you see next is the suburban areas starting to spill out into what was considered rural areas. So, how did cities come to be? How did this even start? Well, it has to do with population growth, of course. When you have more individuals, you have to be able to provide housing and jobs for those individuals. And cities really started booming after we became industrialized, okay? When industry started to grow and it was centralized, and where they built these industries were next to bodies of water or the railroad or major highways later on, because then they could transport goods in and out easily. So a lot of our major cities, you'll notice, have some kind of waterway attached to them or major railroad. And that's what we see right here in Chicago. So in Chicago, located on Lake Michigan, helped that grow as large as it is because they had ready access to water and they could use that water to move goods around because Lake Michigan is huge, okay? So New York City has like Hudson River. You can even look at Louisiana because it's right near waterways to get out into the ocean. So there's lots of cities, large cities, that have access to the water. Now there's other problems with that. We'll get to there too. So changing population trends, usually what we see with our populations is that when populations grow very rapidly, like they're doing in India right now, it creates a lot of environmental problems. And when we look at this, it's basically their resources are overtaxed by the huge increase in population that they're not fiscally able to keep up with that growth in order to create more infrastructure. And so when that happens, you tend to get, so this is like roads in LA, all right? Or you get overcrowded infrastructure in like your subway system, like in New York, which is nowhere near as bad as some places like China. But your infrastructure, which is all your basic facilities and services in your community, things like where you clean your water and where you get your fecal matter removed, and even power plants. We have roads that get overcrowded. So right now we are in our area seeing an expansion of 81. And the reason why we're seeing an expansion of 81 is because our traffic has gotten heavier in and around Roanoke as our population increases. And so we're seeing more and more accidents and more backups of traffic near certain exits. And so they're increasing the size of 81 to facilitate that traffic better as our population increases. All right, schools get taxed, so do hospitals, and so then you need more facilities, basically, which is a big investment. So along with this rapid growth, during this transition from going from not so much of a city type area where people were mostly living in rural type areas to having these large cities, in that transition area is where you see a lot of your standards of living decline, okay? In India, for example, what they see is that wood, which is a major fuel source, and I'm going to post a video for you guys to watch, a major fuel source, that wood gets removed quicker than it can be replaced, and so they have to turn to other things in order to heat their homes and cook their food and boil their water because they don't have the infrastructure in place for those large populations like we happen to already. And then those wastes can overwhelm the water supplies as well. And we see that even in the United States, that we can have our water supplies get damaged by large populations as well. So symptoms of overwhelming populations include something called suburban sprawl, which is what I was talking about when what we're experiencing in Roanoke County is when the city's population spills over into the surrounding area. And this is where you get all these housing developments and the long roads like Orange Ave, where you got all these little businesses on the sides of the road. They're very much associated with suburban sprawl. We get polluted waterways. We get barren land because the land is not usable anymore. Overcrowded schools and inadequate housing, right? Where you can't find good housing or the quality of the housing is very low. So in places like India, back to that fuel wood thing where the wood is removed faster than it can be made, it's the main source of fuel for the poorest countries in the world. A lot of people in the United States still use wood to heat their homes, but it's not the norm anymore, I would say. But in a lot of other places, that is it. So when your population is stable, you can use trees that have already fallen and maintain your ability to cook food and boil water and heat your home that way. But when your population gets too large, then the dead wood can't keep up with your population growth, with your needs and your demand. And so now you have to cut down trees. Well, the problem with cutting down trees is trees grow very slowly. And so the next year, you now no longer have that tree to produce dead wood. And now you are continuing to cut down more and more trees until you don't have trees, and then your land is barren. Okay, and that's a problem, and it contributes to climate change, which we just got done learning about, which is very problematic. So that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the quality of your soil. It's not good for the people living in those areas. So overpopulation can be quite an issue. And this is one of the things that might push people to relocate. So, like I said previously, you have to have your fuel wood to boil your water and cook your food and heat your homes. And you have, in many places, you have to boil the water before you drink it. And if you've ever traveled outside of our country, there's quite a few countries, like if you go to South America, you have to boil the water before you drink it. Okay? And so if they don't have enough wood to boil their water or thoroughly cook their food, then this leads to disease and malnutrition within the population. So unsafe water is a big issue associated with this population growth. And when you do this, you're using the same water sources for both drinking and sewage disposal and cleaning yourself. And so everything is in that water and it's just not sanitary. And so if you're not boiling that water to kill off any bacteria or protists that are in the water, you're going to get diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. So like this little baby in the center picture here, he's not a chubby little baby. That baby's belly is full of parasites. So when they have a high parasite load, it gives them this large belly that makes them look like they've eaten a lot, but really they're starving and they're filled with parasites that are stealing their nutrition. So with this urbanization and this process that occurs, there's a lot of impacts on the land. There's this shortage of what's called arable land. Arable land is land that you can grow crops on, okay? Any land you can grow crops on, because not all land is fit for growing food. It depends on the quality of the soil as well as the access to water. So when you have a growing population, you're making trade-offs on the use of your land. And where are you going to use this land for housing? Because remember, most cities are near water sources. Well, it happens to be those water sources are also what provides you with arable land. And so are you going to grow food there, or are you going to let housing be there? Because industry is going to want to be there too. Are we going to maintain natural habitats? That's a big challenge with a large growing population, because people want places to live. So a great example of one of the problems with urbanization is Egypt. So in Egypt, they have more than 69 million people in that country, which is very small compared to ours, but it's also not as big of an area. So most of this country is desert, which means you can't grow food in the desert. And so only 4% of the land in Egypt is called arable land, where they can actually grow crops. And if you look down here at the bottom, you can see the green there. And this is associated with the river, the Nile River in Egypt, right? And so farming very much depends on access to that river. But the river is also where all the jobs are, because cities and industry goes around routes where they can ship goods, right? So now you have industry and agriculture fighting over this land, who's going to get to be there. Only 4% of the land is arable. And on top of that, people want to live near their jobs. So what do you do? Do you build housing or do you use it for farmland? And those are hard decisions to make, and people aren't going to be happy about it, even though they need that farmland. Like, that's the smart choice to do, right? Grow food, because if you can't feed your people, which happens quite often in Egypt, then you're going to have uprisings. So urbanization is kind of a really tricky balance, and there's a lot of good things about it, and there's some bad things about it. Urbanization in general, the definition is an increase in the ratio or density of people living in an urban area rather than in the rural areas. Okay, so they're moving from rural areas into urban areas, and the bulk of the population is in that urban area. And again, we do this to find jobs, right? We move to the cities to find jobs, and then housing in cities is very hard to find or very expensive. So we move to the suburbs around there, and then the suburbs continue to grow. And this is the problem with the cities. Not really the cities themselves so much as the suburbs, okay? Because suburbs, this suburban sprawl, leads to things like traffic jams, because you're very reliant on a vehicle to get back and forth from the city. And so that puts a lot more vehicles on the road in that area. When you live in the city, all right, like when I lived in New York City, I did not have a car. One, I could not afford a car. But two, I didn't need one because I could walk anywhere I needed to go, or I could take the subway, or I could grab a taxi cab. So I didn't need my own vehicle, and so that kept the number of vehicles on the road down. And it was the people coming into the city from the suburbs that really caused all the problems. Also with that is inadequate infrastructure. As we sprawl out into the suburbs, you have to build new schools for the people who live there because they want their kids to go to school near where they live. You got to have hospitals within driving distance. You got to have police forces that are in those areas. And so now you're talking about a big influx of money that needs to happen in order to provide this infrastructure. And not to mention the roads that need to be built, okay? And so as this suburban sprawl occurs, you take up more and more land that farms are not there anymore. And so now you have to ship in your farm goods, your food, from farther away, which now increases your reliance on more fossil fuels, which leads to climate change, okay? Also, within the city, I mentioned this earlier, the city becomes very, very expensive to live in because there's high demand to live in that city. Because again, if you live in the city, you're not reliant on the vehicles. You don't have to deal with the traffic. You can use mass transit to get to and from work. When you live in the city, the lifestyle is very different, especially a large city like New York City. You don't go shopping for groceries for the week because you don't have a way to transport them. But instead, you go downstairs, and on every block, there's a little grocery store at the bottom of one of the buildings. And so you just pick up your food for that day and maybe the next day. And so inside your apartments, a lot of times you have smaller refrigerators, apartment-sized refrigerators, because you're not doing huge shopping for the whole week there. It's just a different kind of lifestyle. And so it's just a different environment. But definitely high demand for housing. You pay a lot to live there. So as an example, I pulled up New York, right, because that's what I'm familiar with. So here's New York City, and this is a couple years old now, 6 years old already, but here is the cost, a monthly cost for a one-bedroom apartment in New York City. So you look at the rents here, if you were paying this kind of mortgage in a house around here, you'd have like a $500,000 house, okay? So this is significant, the amount that you're paying here. And when I lived there many years ago, we were looking at $1,300 a month for our tiny little apartment. So how does this tie into the environment, the cost of urbanization? Of course, when you have a lot of people living in a small area, there's going to be more pollution. All right, so we're going to have more waste. and we're going to have the infrastructure to deal with that. We're going to have byproducts from industry. We're going to have noise pollution and light pollution. All right, and that's why I told you guys once before that in New York City, basically it could be 4 o'clock in the morning and it's like in the middle of the day here. It's, people, it never sleeps. Another thing we see with cities is this thing called a heat island. Cities tend to be warmer than surrounding areas, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's covered in asphalt. All the buildings and all the roads and all the roofs are covered in asphalt. Now, there are things we could do to mitigate that, but we're slowly making those changes, but we're not quite there. So things like green roofs are one of the things we can do to alter that. The other part is the dependence on importing all of our goods, because none of them are going to be made in the near vicinity of the city, so you have to import everything in, which is a big reliance then on fossil fuels, though the people living in the city are not as reliant on fossil fuels, so that might actually balance itself out. So let's look at this heat island thing, because there's actually a study about Roanoke. Roanoke is a big heat island, even though we're not a huge city. And that's because a lot of our area is covered in asphalt, especially compared to the surrounding area, which gets rural very quickly, right? So here on this map, you can see the city of Roanoke, and here is Salem. And then out from that is, of course, Roanoke County, which is our county. And you can see that our county is much, much cooler. So the dark red is much hotter, right, than the surrounding area. And so what we see is when we have like a snow event or something, that in the city they have significantly less because they tend to be a little warmer, or the snow melts more quickly than the outside surrounding areas. So in the county, when we have snow, if you have people who live up on Bent Mountain, stuff like that, you're going to get a lot more snow than those of you who are living closer to the city area. So we definitely have this heat island. Another part of that, though, is think about summers, okay? Sounds good in the winter for the snow to melt fast, but in the summer, it's always hotter in the city because of all that dark asphalt. So the benefits of urbanization, there's a lot of good things about it. So efficiency, you can use less fuel because everybody's walking or using mass transit, right? It's normal not to have your own vehicle when you live in a large city, especially one that's compact like Chicago or New York City. The goods and stuff is distributed within the neighborhoods. So if you go out in your neighborhood in a large city like New York City, and you go down, at the bottom of all the buildings are your little shops. So you have a grocery store, usually you have some kind of other retail stores, an electronics store, a bakery. So there's different little stores in the bottom. So you can literally do a block and meet almost all of your basic needs for what you need in your home within your little area. And then all the apartments are above those buildings. So it's really easy to just walk out and go get what you need. And of course, your opportunities for entertainment are really good too, because there's always restaurants and things like that that you can go to there. Also with cities, because you usually have large universities are associated with cities, research centers, so there's a lot of sharing of ideas and education and innovation in cities, which leads to more jobs and things like that in the market. The other good thing about cities is if we do cities right, and that's the big key here, if we do cities right, we can preserve the land outside of the city for agriculture and wilderness and biodiversity, and keep our green areas green and keep our cities efficient. But we have to do it right, and that's what we're going to be talking about. What is making a city the right way going to look like?